somebody in a homeless shelter said, you should never get on government assistance because it's a drug and you'll never get off it. And so I started seeing a world on the streets that was very different than the one that the New York Times reported. And it caused a certain amount of cognitive dissonance, that what I'd been told, that the poor were the victims of evil capitalism, what I saw again and again was that they had made very poor decisions, and that the big difference in society was one of personal responsibility. And the taboo, I think the greatest taboo in liberal discourse, is the refusal to acknowledge the role of behavior in producing personal outcomes.
In our version of The Perils of Pauline, we left you at the end of segment 1 with prestigious degrees from prestigious institutions of higher learning. You went to a top-tier law school. You clerked with a very liberal Ninth Circuit judge.
He would be. He'd love to be a justice. Believe me.
Yes,
he
he would.
Ought to be.
That's
thinks
absolutely
he's the
right.
smartest person on that court.
Working for the Environmental Protection Agency in a minor capacity, and so this leads me to a very important question: what happened? Were you mugged, literally or figuratively, in Irving Kristol? I'm alluding, of course, to Irving Kristol's famous definition of neoconservatives as liberals who had been mugged by reality. Tell me the story of your own transformation, if that's not too dramatic a term.
Well, I did have my wallet stolen once in a New York theater, but that really, I think by then I was already pretty darn conservative. I think it was a combination of observing the trashing of Western civilization in the university in the 1980s with the hey, hey, ho, ho, Western civ has got to go. Despite my background as a deconstructionist, again, I was utterly committed to the sanctity of literature and of greatness and of beauty, and a belief that that is the university's mission, is to preserve that legacy and to see the left take over and start to demand that people study based on their own identity, which is so narrow and so pathetically small-minded to think as a female that I should be more interested in reading females than reading great works, or if I were black, that I want to read black writers rather than just the best. That to me was utterly appalling and disgusting. So that began, as well as I was, I think, always meritocratic, and so the increasing role of affirmative action, where you would have academic professors being hired based on gender. Again, I couldn't care less if I had a female teacher. It doesn't make any difference. I don't need a role model or race.
Right.
That to me was also extremely depressing. But then I moved to New York, and I started doing journalism, which I had not done before, but I figured I don't know anything. My only value added is I'm going to actually go out and do some footwork.
Right.
So I would go to welfare offices, and I would go to homeless shelters, and I would talk to the people there. And they sounded like Ronald Reagan. People that were welfare mothers would say, you know what, they should have done this welfare reform years ago, because people are having babies just to get more checks. And they're so lazy they can't even change the 16-watt bulb in their apartment. And somebody in a homeless shelter said, you should never get on government assistance because it's a drug and you'll never get off it. And so I started seeing a world on the streets that was very different than the one that the New York Times reported. And it caused a certain amount of cognitive dissonance, that what I'd been told, that the poor were the victims of evil capitalism, what I saw again and again was that they had made very poor decisions, and that the big difference in society was one of personal responsibility. And the taboo, I think the greatest taboo in liberal discourse, is the refusal to acknowledge the role of behavior in producing personal outcomes. So the New York in the late 80s, early 90s was also the dominance, the rise, the meteoric rise of Al Sharpton. And we saw very vicious race politics
Yes,
going
yes.
on. So at that point, I think there was little left of the liberal belief system that I had not seen challenged with my own eyes.
As you alluded to earlier, I mean, according to deconstructionism, the self doesn't exist. So personal responsibility would seem not to follow from academic deconstructionism.
Right.
But you don't blame that. I mean, this is interesting to me. You have, as a secondary cause, the rise of multiculturalism or of ethnic liberalism, identity liberalism, and so forth. And do you, is it your view that those two events are not connected or not deeply connected, but essentially independent of each other, those two developments on the left?
Of deconstruction and identity politics?
Right.
Well, it's actually, that's an interesting question, and it is quite ironic. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but it's a twist of history. Deconstruction was obsessed with this idea of différence, and this was a linguistic idea for them. They said the fact that the word dog is arbitrarily and is different related to the actual entity dog means that we can never have meaning. Well, this is absurd.
Right.
They actually were fanatics for truth because they had so exalted a standard for truth that the fact that language was a set of arbitrary signs, which it indisputably is, for them meant, well, then it can never be true. It must always be false. That's ridiculous. But so they had this idea of différence, that language was always going to miss its mark. Well, then this idea of difference was taken up by the multiculturalists and turned into another battle cry, which was ethnic difference, gender difference, and the self, ironically, which had been denied by deconstruction, came back like the return of the oppressed, and it all was about the self.
With a vengeance.
With a vengeance.
Yeah.
And now it's difference. We have to focus on this notion that, you know, being gay is so different that you need your own gay studies, but it's all narcissism. It's all about the self. And to me, this is such a betrayal of the humanistic ideal, which in the Renaissance you had Petrarch, the original humanist, writing letters in Latin to the classics, to Cicero and Virgil and Homer, because he wanted to enter their world and he felt like he could talk to them. That was what study was escaping the self to enter a different world. Today,
And like Frederick Douglass saying something very similar many hundreds of years later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I walk with Shakespeare. Du Bois said, you know, I can speak across the color line. Shakespeare and Alexander Dumas, they
Right.
walk arm in arm with neither condescension nor scorn. And that sense of humanity and being drawn to greatness, not to the petty narrowness of the self, is what the humanity should be. So deconstruction spawned many enormities, and it is responsible because the language, this crabbed, artificial language, has just been transformed. But it's a continuity and a discontinuity.
Now, did you have or develop in this period an intellectual hero or a series of heroes, or a political hero or political heroes, or were you on your own in a way in this journey?
I would say intellectual heroes, again, I did love speech act theory, but I think I was really striving to make journalism clear and to give people a sense of what it looked like on the streets, because not everybody has the privilege of being able to
Right.
go and try and research a story and go talk to the victims of crime in New York City. So,
And what about Rudy Giuliani? Was he, I mean, for a lot of conservatives, especially those in New York, in those years, Giuliani was important in a way that Reagan was important for a lot more people around the country, as examples of of reformers who could actually improve the lives of the people they were representing, who could get something done, and who were not simply singing, joining in the chorus of conservative decline,
Yes.
but who could actually improve the way government worked.
Giuliani was an amazing figure, and I am so lucky to have been educated by his vision of urban transformation, as you say, Charles. It really was a belief in cities that conservatives are sometimes caricatured as being non-urban,
Right.
which is not true. And the
Did
thing
you
about
did you expect him to be successful?
You know, I really, I have not begun from a set of principles. I think when Giuliani came in, I was still learning myself. I was just starting to write, and really learned the conservative wisdom completely from the ground up. So I didn't really even have expectations for Giuliani because I was still casting off liberal assumptions about government, big government, and poverty. But what I did see, but I think again, the core that I've always had is meritocracy. So one of my early articles that Giuliani seized upon, and I have to say did transform the City University of New York, was writing about the decimation of this large public university system in New York. It's just a city public university called the City University of New York, by the practice of open admissions, where they junked their academic requirements in the 1970s in order to diversify. And I wrote that this was trashing the university. We have to have, at a bare minimum, you should be able to read and write if you want to enter college. Giuliani had a gut understanding. I remember going to a press conference that he gave after having implemented my suggestions and raised the standards and got rid of open admissions at CUNY. And he was asked by a Puerto Rican journalist, well, don't you feel like you're disrespecting,
Right.
minority students? And Giuliani totally spontaneously, without any preparation, said, education is not about seeking respect for yourself. It's about learning outside of yourself and breaking the narrowness of your own identity. And he had this gut understanding of, again, of personal responsibility, of the reciprocity of the government social contract. So he was doing his own version of welfare reform in parallel to the national 96 reform, and spoke persuasively and honestly about, okay, we're going to help you, but you have to help yourself. And he was taking baby steps to addressing the big taboo, which was family breakdown, but then his own marriage was sort of awry, and so he backed off at the last minute, which was too bad. So we had to wait another 20 years before our next Republican mayor, at the end of his term, actually took on the issue of teen pregnancy, which is only a small part of family breakdown, but it was better than nothing. But yes, Giuliani was an extraordinary transformative figure, and of course his most remembered success was in public safety.
We'll talk about that some more.